Some things in the video game world just ended up being ahead of their time. Whether it was overly ambitious, a little cringeworthy, maybe too expensive, or maybe the public just wasn't ready for it yet, but the kids were gonna love it. References aside, today we're talking about 10 video game things that were ahead of their time. Starting off at number 10, the PSP, man. You knew we were going to kick this off with a bang. The renewed popularity of handhelds with stuff like Steam Deck and Nintendo Switch, and that rumor that PS6 might actually have some handheld console capabilities. We figured it was a better time than ever to look back at like one of the OG handhelds that were just crazy ahead of its time. This was originally released in March 2005 in the US and December in Japan. It was Sony's attempt to break into the handheld market that Nintendo had been dominating for years with the Game Boy line of systems. They were flush with cash after the massive success of the PS2 and saw an entirely new revenue stream to exploit. Now, while the PSP didn't end up being the infinite money cheat that Sony probably wanted it to be like a Game Boy, it was still pretty successful, especially considering how much of a stranglehold Nintendo had on the market at the time. Now, at the time, the PSP was able to push some pretty impressive graphics for a handheld. I was so hyped for this thing. Being able to play what was essentially like a Grand Theft Auto 3-like game on the go was wild. The system was never able to play games that looked quite as good as something from consoles at the time, but it was able to get pretty close. And that by itself was impressive as hell. The visuals it was able to push were a step up for handhelds at the time, but what made the PSP truly revolutionary was its multimedia features. The PSP was essentially a smartphone before smartphones, offering all kinds of functionality from internet browsing to audio and video playback. Honestly, it was one of the first devices I had that could connect to Wi-Fi, but I was too poor to even have Wi-Fi. In many ways, this PlayStation Portable was the first truly successful iteration of the home console you could bring with you. It was nearly as powerful as a PlayStation 2, sorta, and it was great for listening to music, and its media transfer software mode made it easy to load up files from your PC onto the system without a lot of trouble. There was even a TV adapter that let you play the PSP on the TV, kind of like a reverse switch. The resolution was terrible, but hey, it was an option. The thing about the PSP is that it wasn't really the first attempt at making a multimedia handheld. The Nokia N-Gage, of course, attempted the same thing and came out a year-ish earlier, but I think it's pretty safe to say that the PSP was the first successful attempt at making such a device. Now, various factors led to the PSP ultimately underperforming in Sony's eyes, I guess, yeah, sure, but today it's considered one of our all-time great handhelds and was ahead of its time in a lot of ways. And again, like we said at the start, with all major consoles at least considering going the handheld or handheld hybrid route, it's looking more and more like the PSP was the future of the industry. It just arrived at the wrong time. Now at number 9, the Matrix Awakens demo. Remember this? This was released just back in 2021 as both a tech demo for Unreal Engine 5 and the upcoming Matrix Resurrections movie. This short-lived demo was the first real taste of what was in store for the next generation of consoles. It felt like the future with incredible draw distances and hyper-realistic visuals. But a funny thing happened. The future this demo promised never really quite materialized. The actual gameplay of this thing was very simple. It was a demo. It was nothing to write home about. We're mostly just talking about the graphics here. These days, Unreal Engine 5 is mostly known and derided for its somewhat inconsistent performance, its consistent shader streaming issues. And even that, with that aside, it just feels like Unreal Engine 5 hasn't gotten us games that look quite like this yet. It's interesting because while certain aspects of the technology are fairly widespread now, like the Lumen lighting engine or the MetaHuman creator for NPCs that a lot of games use, it still doesn't feel like we've gotten a game that is actually really able to match or surpass what The Matrix Awakens was showing us. While the movie it was promoting was kind of forgettable and Unreal Engine 5 ended up not being the massive leap forward that demos like this quite promised consumers, The Matrix Awakens is still just an impressive example of what can happen on, a consumer console and of course high-end PCs. What games could potentially look like. A lot of times it still feels like we're a long way off from something that looks exactly like this with fully modeled 3D scanned characters, crazy ray trace environments, environments and NPCs that can generate conversations. Look, with console makers and developers seemingly trying to push for less expensive visuals and quicker turnarounds on games in the future, we're not sure if we'll see a game that utilizes Unreal Engine like this. I don't know, it hasn't happened yet. Next at number 8, sure, Xbox Network was definitely ahead of the curve when it first went online in 2002, but it was not the first subscription-based online service for playing online multiplayer on consoles. There were a few of these types of services floating around, so it's hard to determine what really was the actual first online gaming network, but at least one of the first was X-Band, which originally came out in 1994. Yes, more than 30 years ago. This was a few years before the internet started to become real commonplace in American households, and like when stuff like America Online took hold. Now, you read a lot online, like most estimates are the internet really becoming widespread around 1997 or 1998, but the X-Band was allowing kids to play their Super Nintendo and Genesis games online back in 1994. The first commercial internet service providers only started appearing in 1989, so this was only a few years after that. Think about it, you really couldn't be more cutting edge with this technology if you tried. How these things worked was that you'd insert the X-Band cartridge into the console, and then whatever game you actually want to play on the service on top of that. Your phone line would connect into the side of the X-Band cart. That's how it would connect online, as long as you had a subscription to the service, which cost like $5 a month. The main menu was pretty primitive by today's standards, but there was a mail function and a newsletter on top of the actual game playing. Only certain games are supported, but we do remember seeing stuff like Doom being covered. It was almost unplayably slow, but the fact that you could go online and play with strangers felt like a revolutionary thing. This is a situation where they were probably a little too far ahead of their time. The actual technology just wasn't quite there yet. The adoption wasn't really there yet. The company was always small and never really managed to make a profit, it seems. The concept of online gaming would eventually become a massive business, but it would still be like another decade before it became mainstream. They were really onto something though. Next at number 7, I know it's kind of a cliche at this point to talk about how forward-thinking and innovative the original Shenmue was, but there's a reason why it keeps getting brought up even today. It was a game that was ahead of its time in a lot of significant ways. When you look at Shenmue today, yeah, the world is small, the voice acting is often laughable.
Years ago, I was Chinese. Now, I'm a naturalized Japanese.
And it's pretty limited in what you actually do in the game, but you have to look at the game and kind of the context when it came out. When Shenmue came out in '99, open world games didn't exist. Fully voice acted games weren't super common, especially for ones the size of Shenmue. And the depth of the world was like rarely matched by games for a long time. The thing that makes Shenmue so special is how dense and detailed the world actually is. Like, again, it's not all that big. It's mostly just a neighborhood area, a small shopping district, and then the port area. But while the actual size of the map isn't that big, the level of detail they crammed into these tiny spaces is still really impressive when you think about it. You can open any drawer and fully explore houses, even when it's pointless. Every NPC you encounter is an actual character with dialogue that changes depending on the situation, the weather, and all other kinds of factors. They also have a daily cycle where they move around the world, go to work, and do things at night like go shopping or hit the bar. Again, this was crazy for this time. It's not something that hadn't been attempted before, but like the attention to detail here and the execution of it was impressive. Like how they actually took the time to match up the game's weather with actual forecasts from 1986, which, you know, is the year the game takes place. So if it rains on a certain day in the game, like the in-game calendar, you can bet that it probably rained in the real world in Japan on that day back in 1986. That's just one example of like the crazy attention to detail in this game. This sort of thing is everywhere, and while a lot of it is stuff you might not actually notice, and I'll be honest, a lot of it I didn't notice as a kid playing, it does all come together to create a unique, kind of weird atmosphere that no other game, or even its sequels, were able to match. Next at number 6, while we're on the topic of Sega, we might as well hit on the one that got away, man, the legendary Sega Dreamcast. It only lasted a little more than 2 years, but its forward-thinking ideas and good library of eclectic and interesting games have made Sega's final console a subject of endless fascination by gaming fans, the game industry at large, everyone really. We're all in agreement. While most people talk about the great library of games, actually part of what makes the Dreamcast so interesting is often kind of ignored. It's online functionality. I get why this stuff is overlooked. You can't access any of it anymore, so people coming into the cult of Dreamcast late never had the chance to experience any of this stuff, but keep in mind that the Dreamcast was in many ways a revolutionary system, not just for online multiplayer games, but for online connected home consoles in general. This was the first console to include a built-in modem for internet access, I believe, and the first console to offer DLC, technically, for games that you could download and play directly onto the console. For as innovative as the games on the console were, the thing that really makes the Dreamcast ahead of its time is how the console was built for the online services. They made special virtual showrooms for Toyota cars, for example. And there were so many more weird little things you could do with the Dreamcast in Japan where they really went wild with the console. They were practically trying to sell it as some kind of alternative to a home PC. It was very weird, but also pretty interesting. Of course, the Dreamcast failed, even with all these forward-thinking ideas, because ultimately Sega had lost consumer confidence after bungling the launches of the 32X Genesis add-on and the Saturn, and even to some extent this Dreamcast, so a lot of people just passed over this system and went to the mega hit that was the PS2. It's a shame because the thing was just ahead of its time. The hardware, the online stuff I mentioned, the games, it was awesome. Next at number 5, here's a bit of a throwback. Halo, of course, was pretty forward-thinking as far as console FPS games go. It really set the standard in a lot of ways in terms of how it controlled and how it was. But did you know that there was a multiplayer FPS that came out 3 years earlier that had one-button grenade throwing, regenerating shields, and vehicle combat? And not just that, it also had massive multiplayer maps that could accommodate up to 120 players simultaneously. Yeah, this is Star Siege Tribes. DICE has fully admitted that Tribes is the game that inspired them to create the original Battlefield 1942. It's also one of the first ever multiplayer exclusive FPS games, in a time where that was considered bold because most multiplayer focused games still launched with a substantial campaign. Tribes really got there first with a lot of stuff. It's a highly influential game, but it's still very much its own thing. Nothing else quite does the skating, that feel of movement, quite like this one. It's like bunny hopping on steroids. It was completely unintentional in the original game, but they leaned into it with later Tribes games, and that was a smart move because it's so unique and so fun. And this game was doing massive battlefields well before that sort of game type was common practice. And keep in mind, dial-up was still how everyone was getting online back then. So getting it so that up to 120 players could play together in a single game without it being a total mess, that must have been a nearly impossible task, but somehow they pulled it off. And in this modern day, not enough people give it props. Next at number 4, Nintendo is often derided for playing it safe and being behind the curve when it comes to online services and connectivity, but what you might not know is that they were actually innovating in this space way before everyone else. It's just that the rest of the world never really got to see it. In September 1988, a year before commercial internet service providers were even a thing, Nintendo put out the, quote, Family Computer Network System, which was essentially a modem you'd insert on top of the Famicom, which could then be used to do stuff online like view weather forecasts, look up video game cheat codes, read jokes, and I'm not kidding here, actually download content. The original Nintendo Entertainment System had DLC all the way back in 1988, which is just blowing our minds. Sure, it was apparently basic stuff, like a digital version of the board game Go, and I'm not even sure if it ever actually got a wide release at all, but at least they were trying, at least they were developing the idea back then. And that's not all the service offered either. There was also, weirdly enough, a stock trading application. You could buy stamps online, and there was horse betting. The Nintendo had online betting. Yes, it was truly the system of the future. And it should come as no surprise at all that the horse betting application was by far the most popular thing on this system, which just goes to show that no matter the age, People just want to bet on stuff. The network did not last long. By 1991, it was already mostly shut down. And other than the Satellaview, which is somehow even weirder thing, Nintendo mostly stopped dabbling in these sorts of innovative, gambles with online tech and stuck with what really worked for them. Now, all the online stuff they do seems like they're doing it because they have to. But you can't use your Nintendo Switch to bet on the horses. Now at number 3, Body Harvest. This mostly forgotten Nintendo 64 game from 1998 was incredibly innovative for the time. In an age before Grand Theft Auto 3, you could steal cars and explore a non-linear environment and basically do whatever you wanted here. It wasn't fully open world, as the game was split into several distinct missions, but each mission is surprisingly open and allowed the player to progress through them however they wanted. And the game was made by DMA Design. So if that sounds familiar, it's because they would go on to become Rockstar North. The guys who actually made Grand Theft Auto 3. In so many ways, Body Harvest is a sort of dry run for what they do in GTA 3 just a few years later. Of course, the basic formula here that had already been established with the original Grand Theft Auto, but transferring that to like a fully 3D environment was something entirely different and had never been attempted to this degree before. The thing about Body Harvest is that it's not so much like a great game as it is an interesting historical piece to look at if you're interested in, the evolution of the Grand Theft Auto franchise. It's an essential stepping stone to reaching the first real open world game with GTA 3, which eventually leads to Rockstar's, of course, world domination. GTA 5 is still the singular most profitable entertainment product. You can make a pretty clear connection between the biggest franchise of all time and this weird little Nintendo 64 action game. Humble beginnings. This is where it all started, and this is why I love video game history. And now at number 2, the original Ultima games are important and innovative in their own right, but this spin-off game, Ultima Underworld, was so ahead of its curve in so many ways, both in terms of game design and tech, that it's almost impossible to ignore when talking about, innovative games. The developers of the game downplay just how important this game is by just saying that the technology was rapidly evolving at the time and that anybody else could have done what this game ended up doing first, but Underworld was the first game to have a fully 3D environment that allowed players to look up and down, so it gets the credit. When you look at 3D games from the early 90s, they're fairly limited in what they allow players to do. You can walk around and shoot stuff like in Doom, and that's about it. But in Underworld, you could actually pick up things in the environment, you could interact with puzzles, jump and swim and talk to NPCs. It was a far more in-depth simulation beyond just about what every other game was at the time. Sure, this sort of stuff was possible in far more basic top-down RPGs, but Ultima Underworld had a fully 3D environment. It was doing stuff that wouldn't be commonplace in other 3D games for quite a few years. And that was all the way back in 1992. Playing this game was kind of like peering into the future. There was nothing else coming out at the time that was even close to matching this type of depth, this type of feel. There were real opportunities for role-playing and exploration in a fully rendered environment. This is all stuff that's commonplace now with everything being some degree of an RPG hybrid, but this game came out way before that, when every game had to, fit into a specific mold. Underworld was something different. A first-person game that was also an RPG that also had elements of immersive sims. There's a degree of detail here that even modern games can struggle to match. Look, it's not going to impress anyone today with its visuals, but its world is incredibly interactive for something that came out almost a year before Doom. Now down at number 1, did you know that in 2002, Nintendo was running an online store where you could buy games digitally 1 year before Steam? Nintendo was doing this almost a decade before the eShop was a thing. So yes, once again, Nintendo surprises us with internet stuff and store stuff. Look, how it actually worked wasn't really innovative because like you didn't get to actually download your games from the internet. Instead, it was a mail-in service where you had to send a special blank cartridge to Nintendo directly, and then they would load up the games you purchased onto the cart and then pay for the service on delivery. It was all part of this strange program called Nintendo Power. Not to be confused with the magazine of the same name, the Nintendo Power was essentially a flash cart that had a limited amount of space, but could hold like up to 8 games in storage, and you could buy them for a discounted price. Of course, you also had to buy the blank cart by itself, so in the end, the total cost of these games wasn't really lowered by all that much when you factor in the additional purchase, but it was still an interesting idea that was essentially devised to get around the rental problem in Japan. Unlike in the US, renting games back then wasn't allowed. Even though Nintendo played a central part in making renting games in Japan illegal, the lack of cheaper option for more casual players was a problem for them, which they tried to solve with this Nintendo Power system. Well, technically, this whole thing started back in 1987 with the Famicom Disk System, which actually had a similar system where you could kind of take a blank cartridge to an in-store kiosk and purchase games that would then get written on the disc. But the Power cartridge was a bit more of an elaborate system, and the whole in-store kiosk thing may have been innovative at the time, but not so much anymore. It's the online purchasing that was actually really interesting here and ahead of its time, even if, again, it wasn't the first time game purchases were done online. Stuff like GameLine got there first, which allowed for digital game rentals all the way back in 1983, which sounds completely nuts, but it was technically a thing. It didn't last long, but it happened. Online stores and digital games are commonplace now, but it took a long time and a lot of weird trial and error to get where we are today. Those are 10 things that were ahead of their time, but one bonus thing we had to mention was one for the road, Jurassic Park Trespasser. This game from 1998 is a total mess, a lovable dumb mess that I can't help but always look at. It's mostly because of how crazy ambitious the developers were. They wanted to make the ultimate Jurassic Park simulator, and they definitely failed spectacularly, but they still managed to get some pretty incredible gameplay concepts and features into the game that like wouldn't really become commonplace in the industry for years. The physics system here alone is pretty mind-blowing for the time, but that's really just the start of what this game was doing. It had dynamic shadows, bump mapping, complex NPC AI, which mostly didn't work, but it's the thought that counts, and more stuff. Like even things as basic as object collision were not really as strong in 1988, and this game had a lot of it. It's just a real showcase of game-changing technology all wrapped up in an almost unplayable, unfun, buggy, bad game. But hey, I guess life finds a way. Anyway, those are 10 things in the video game world that were just way ahead of their time. We'd love to hear your opinions in the comments. Was there something that you experienced as a young kid and thought it was gonna be the future, but people weren't ready for it yet? Anything at all? Hit us up, we'd love to hear from you. Now, if you like this video, clicking the like button helps us out. We appreciate it. And if you're new, consider subscribing because we put out videos every single day. But as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.